My name is Phil LeNir. I am president of Coaching Ourselves, and I'm very happy to introduce to you and have a chance for you to hear from Dr. John Boudreau. This event is brought to you by Coaching Ourselves. In today's hybrid workplace, leaders value connection and learning together in small groups, among many other things. Coaching Ourselves is peer learning in groups, guided by expert content. Coaching Ourselves has a catalog of peer learning discussion guides with expert content developed by world-renowned management and leadership thinkers such as John Boudreau. With Coaching Ourselves, learning and leadership development professionals can run leadership cafes, events for your management offsites or your employee resource groups, develop an emerging leader program, continuous learning program, and of course, build learning communities in your organization. Coaching Ourselves offers a train the trainer, so the HR and L&D professionals can use any of the 100 peer learning discussion guides to facilitate your sessions. And this is the one resource that every L&D and HR department should have in its toolkit. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to that. And now on to today's session. John, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I'd like to start by asking you to share your journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your thinking.
Well, thank you, Phil. And let me just echo your comments about Coaching Ourselves and what a wonderful resource that it is. And also to give early credit to my very good friend and colleague, Ravin J. Suthasan, the co-author and lead author on the book we'll be talking about, Work Without Jobs. I encourage everyone to find Ravin and follow him as well, a global renowned thought leader in his own right. And it's an honor to have colleagues like you, Phil, and Ravin in my life. So, and indeed, my story probably is one of sequential, marvelous mentorship. The resume is 40 years at this as a professor of human resources, and then a professor of strategy and human resources and human capital, and finally a writer on the future of work and organizations. I was at Cornell University, which some people may know well, for 22 years, again, privileged with mentors like Lee Dyer and George Milkovich and a whole host of other terrific folks that have moved on to leadership positions in the academic world. And then working with Ed Lawler and the wonderful community of scholars at the Center for Effective Organizations and the Department of Management and Organization at University of Southern California. And that was 15 years, and semi-retired about 5 or 6 years ago to my place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I am now. The red line through my work, Phil, I think, is the often fuzzy connection between things like HR work and work relationships and the mutual goals of workers and organizations, often called organizational strategy. I like to think that if I'm successful, my humble contributions perhaps make work relationships better, clearer, more transparent, more collaborative for those frontline workers. My father fixed large IBM computers in the 1960s, and I often think of him as when I work with companies like IBM and others, and hope that my work makes their lives and their work lives better.
Thank you. And I just don't want you to understate it too much for everyone listening. Really, John has published hundreds of articles, dozens of books. And what I've noticed as somebody external looking in at his career and his work is that he's always done a lot of work on HR analytics and data and proof. And he's used that, let's say, analytical focus to drive through and help us better understand the world that many of us live in, which is this world of organizations. So, Work Without Jobs, a book that you came out last year. You introduce a rich set of ideas and lines of thinking. And I took a quote here from the beginning of your book. You say, typically, work is constructed into job descriptions, and these job descriptions become a repository of competencies, performance indicators, and reward packages. This obscures powerful opportunities to optimize your workforce's productivity, alignment, and engagement. Tapping those opportunities require deconstruction and reconstruction, a vital emerging capability for organizations. So this idea, as chapter 1 is called in your book, work as deconstructed job elements versus stable jobs. Can you unpack this for us, Dr. John Boudreau?
I sure can, Phil. Thank you.
Thanks.
Please call me John. That's fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a metaphor that I like to use. I think this can seem pretty daunting when we say, in essence, what Robin and I are saying is that we should deconstruct all the elements of the work relationship into their components, and that can be pretty disconcerting to say that we should take this comfortable thing called a job and deconstruct it, this comfortable idea of a job holder as a worker and deconstruct it, and this comfortable notion of a degree as a qualification or as a requirement for holding a job, and deconstruct that. I like a couple of metaphors. One is the metaphor of ice cubes, and so we could think about jobs, job holders, and degrees as ice cubes, the traditional square frozen ice cube. And we could certainly devise systems to work with those cubes as frozen elements, fit them together, etc. That's kind of the way a lot of systems work. I suggest thinking of those cubes as melting and then reconfiguring. So droplets of water begin to form on a table. And in the world that Robin and I talk about, those droplets would be the components of a job, its tasks, some might call it gigs, projects, etc. The components of a job holder, who would be seen as a complete array of what I call capabilities. Very often today, the word skills is kind of used for this concept, where we look at all the things that a worker can do as individual elements. And those individual elements of what a worker could do could be matched with individual elements of what a job was, these tasks, etc. And then finally, in the world of learning, we can think about degrees as the ice cubes, and that's deconstructed into elements like individual classes, individual badges, qualifications, experiences, etc. As you said, this deconstruction and reconstruction idea has been helpful in a vast array of fields. And so I like to reassure my colleagues that this is not something that has never been thought of before. And in fact, there are lots of tools. I worked with a company that made pet food, and we were working on this project. And the metaphor we used for their leaders was to say, in the old world, you had to make pet food out of things like bone and meat and maybe water, something like that. And those were the building blocks you had. Then someone discovered nutrients that were embedded in those building blocks and realized that if we can separate or deconstruct the nutrients from the things that carry them, the bone, the meat, etc., we could construct dog food in a much more, or pet food in a much more optimized way. And that's really what Robin and I are talking about when we talk about those areas where deconstructed workers, and learning might offer opportunities to organizations to see their way through some tough dilemmas.
Yeah, and as I was reading the book and discovering the concept, as you mentioned, this idea of deconstructing jobs, frankly, is something that all of us do, if you wish, automatically without
Indeed.
thinking about it. Certainly, as I started coaching ourselves, and we're a small entrepreneurial company, at the beginning, as the president, I was doing all sorts of tasks that had to get done to make the company move forward. And then as we're going forward, people are saying, well, Phil, you shouldn't be doing all those things. And what they're saying is you should deconstruct your job as it kind of evolved. And all the kind of bookkeeping and everything, well, that should go to a bookkeeper, and she's working with lots of different companies and she's more optimal at that, and then you'll be freed up to take on others. So this idea of deconstruction and reconstruction we're doing constantly. And what, if I could just, for everyone's benefit, what I love about the book is you drive that thinking forward in a far more analytical way, in a far more logical way, as you unpack the thinking, and it really helped me think about this bigger picture. If I could mention the last one, John, I never realized how much we get married to our jobs. We have this job description and we get married to it, and suddenly that's it, and it's unchangeable. And that, of course, leads to inefficiencies over time. Indeed. As the needs change.
Indeed. Your entrepreneurial example is a good one, Phil. I think it's now just classic as we think about the evolution of startup companies and small companies, the situation where the founder and maybe the founder and a few colleagues get married to those job descriptions that evolved when it started. And I've been involved in several startups at that painful moment where we need to have a talk with the founder about the idea that the job or let's call it the task descriptions of a CEO of a company of 200 people look very different than the job description that they've been comfortable doing. And it may be time for them, just as you said, to give up some of that, to allow it to melt and to reconstruct it into a job of a professional CEO. And you need to become the head of innovation or something. Same thing with your colleague who's good at accounting and had this job description called a CFO, because that sounded great. And you had that available on the web. And it's time for you to have a talk with them and and bring in a professional CFO and find a way to deconstruct the parts of the work that they're really good at.
Yeah. And so then, if I could take it forward, one of the challenges with this whole line of thinking, which perhaps others have challenged you, is this idea that you want to, as your chapter says, not replace jobs with automation, but optimizing these task level combinations of human and automation. And a quick story, in the 1990s, I was in the technical domain and we did speech recognition software, and our job was to automate the first couple of seconds of a 411 call. So we were essentially deconstructing part of the job of a 411 operator by automating a first portion of that call. Now, we were very happy with our projects and building all these cool speech recognition tools, but we had a somewhat negative feeling, like we were roboticizing jobs. And this was the 90s, and we were. Now, all that said, as I went through your book, you've changed my perspective significantly on these original feelings I had in the 1990s. And I want to just make a quote or two for everyone. So you said, by definition, the system, which is this new work operating system that you talk about in the book, it humanizes the workforce as each combination of deconstructed skills is completely unique, allowing organizations to make more objective, unbiased talent decisions, because of course you're matching the skills of people with the skills that are needed, as opposed to, like you said, using your job. And you finally make this statement, which was a bit provocative for me: workers as a whole person with an array of deconstructed capabilities. Tell us more about this idea of not replacing jobs with automation, but optimizing these task level combinations.
Well, thank you, Phil. And to put it in perspective, I think you've touched on one of the most, I think, provocative and interesting triggers that should cause leaders to say, perhaps we need to think about work in a different way. And that trigger would be, broadly stated, automation and work automation. Other triggers we talked about are similar to the one you mentioned in your example. The idea that there are qualified workers, like your contractor or gig worker or freelance accountant. There are qualified workers out there who may not want to engage with us as an employee, or it may not be appropriate to engage with them as an employee. That's another trigger. Agility is another trigger, where you say, for some reason, we can't seem to move quickly enough to meet our agility and change goals. Very often, one of the things that's in the way is this idea of jobs as the way we'll characterize work. So what I'm saying here is, we don't have to do this everywhere, but automation is representative of a number of places where I think leaders find themselves confronted with vaguely stated problems, like, is this going to replace everybody's job? Like, people are afraid of automation. We sold automation based on the FTEs that we would get back, and yet we still need those workers. That's kind of what you hear. So now let's talk about your kind question about this. It turns out that if you look at any of the research on work automation, Robin and I wrote a book about work automation 2 books ago. So now it's been probably 5-10 years. All that research ended up deconstructing the work, because the only way you can really see the pattern of automation is at the level of the tasks in the job. That's where automation can be seen to indeed replace humans in some of those tasks, very much like your 411 example. We're going to replace humans detecting what language is being spoken and routing the call to someone who speaks that language. But that's only part of the call center work. So you need to look at the tasks, and you can see them be replaced, be augmented, or be completely transformed. And in the augmentation and transformation parts of work automation, you keep the humans, and you now work with their capabilities and this task level work analysis to say, okay, if these things have gone away, but we still need these things done by humans plus automation, then how do we reconfigure the work? Generative AI today, were we rewriting the book today, we would have many examples of generative AI. If you go back, those of you listening, and read the stories of how people are using generative AI and many of the fears of generative AI, you will find that there is a deconstruction going on. That what's really happening is that we're experimenting with humans combining with generative AI, whether it's students in college using generative AI to write a rough draft, or reporters or writers like me. There's a wonderful example from 10 years ago that I used of a songwriter who at that time had AI that if she started a melody would suggest ways to finish it. It would suggest a chord structure underneath that melody. I like to think of it as humans surfing AI. And I think IBM put it well in one of their analyses. Workers using AI may replace workers who aren't using AI. But the proper way to think of it is how much of the tasks in a job are affected by AI and how. And I'm delighted to see that kind of analytical metaphor. How much of your work will be affected by automation is a much better question than will your job be replaced by automation, which it almost never is. So in the book, Robin and I have a number of pre-generative AI examples like call centers, distribution centers, even high-level work like freelance CEOs, CFOs, et cetera, and automation of scheduling and other things in nursing and things like that. So the idea, I guess, in the book would be, Phil, that the only way really to see your way through these work automation dilemmas is to stop thinking of it in terms of automation replacing workers in jobs, and instead empower your workers, managers, and leaders to begin to think of it as automation plus workers and a constant process of deconstruction and reconstruction as automation advances.
Right. There's something that you said just early on in the what you just said, these idea of these triggers, and that I hadn't quite gotten until you just mentioned that now, in the sense that, I came from the age in the 1990s where we were firmly wedded with this idea, oh my gosh, robots are going to replace humans and it's bad, and I don't want to do that. I feel some moral dilemma or something like that.
Right.
And of course, you can equally ask, as we asked ourselves in the 90s, maybe people are bored of asking what language do you want to speak 30 times a day, and a robot can do that. Yeah. And these operators can do the more interesting conversation of helping the people with a special need to get the telephone number and so on and so forth in the 411. But, we had that bias, if you wish, that we wanted to be morally good, and so we couldn't go in that direction. We had trouble with that. But what you just said was, it's not just that. You also talked about triggers. So you said maybe you're not getting enough agility in the workforce, or maybe there's some inefficiencies or things aren't going wrong. And one option that you can have is to look at deconstructing the jobs, because that could be the cause of the lack of agility and the inefficiencies.
That's right. I like to say, thanks to your work, perhaps Robin and my book will become a bestseller, and we'll see a day where your workers and managers on the front line come to you and say, we need that work operating system that John and Robin wrote about. That would be great. That's not happening today. What you have are somewhat less precise signals, less direct signals, no one asking for the book. But when you hear people saying, I just can't seem to figure out how to solve this work automation dilemma. I can't figure out how to integrate people who engage with us as non-employees with our employee workforce. I can't figure out how to move the work fast enough to be agile. Those are what you hear. And what I'd love is for HR leaders and other leaders to say, wait a minute, have we thought about using a tool that would free people up from thinking about jobs, and see what that produces?
Fascinating. So then that takes us to the next set of thinking. How do we do this? Now that we have an idea of the motivations and the triggers for us to start deconstructing and looking at the jobs, and we understand the benefits, In your book, you talk about perpetually reinventing and deconstructing work, chapter 6, I believe. And in this chapter, you talk about this idea. You said, this is your opportunity to challenge the chief human resource officer to expand beyond their traditional role as a supporting partner to the business units. Instead, HR can become a hub of agile experimentation and learning applied to work design. Tell us a little bit about this line of thinking, how to get there.
So this started actually several years ago. When COVID appeared, I made a good effort to retire here, Phil, to Santa Fe. And then COVID happened. And number one, everybody realized we could engage remotely and that it didn't matter that I was in Santa Fe. And so that was great. People knew what Zoom and WebEx were. And then, of course, there became a lot of questions about the future of work. COVID really shined a massive spotlight on that. So during 2020, 2021, I'm working with companies that are working, great people, navigating their way through this. Who's going to work at home? Who's going to work remotely? All that sort of thing. And I kind of I got tired of saying, your leaders are asking you for a policy about how many days people will be in the office. And it's the wrong question, and I would tell my HR colleagues usually, I'm happy to go to your leadership team and tell them that they're asking the wrong question. And then I'll get fired, but then you've at least opened up the conversation, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I came to as a more positive thing than saying you're asking the wrong question, and this was with the help of my colleague, Pete Ramstead, with whom we wrote the first article about this, the best future of work policy is to start with, we don't know. And that sounds daunting. That sounds like an abdication. HR says, well, what's our policy for the future of work or return to the office? We don't know. Then you think about it and you say, well, what would your best software and product designers say about the future of your products? And I think looking at the world of agile and lean and design thinking, the answer is we don't know. We don't know what our software will look like 5 or 10 years from now. We don't know what our automobiles will look like in a world of electrified vehicles, et cetera. We can't say that for sure, but that doesn't paralyze us. Turns out they have lots of tools, some I mentioned, lean, design thinking, agile, et cetera, that have been around for decades. We don't know is not a reason to lament or to be discouraged. It's the beginning of a much different conversation about perpetually evolving products and services with the input of customers and users. And so in a simple manner, what I'm talking about would be get those people that are good at that kind of thinking, bring them in a room and say, I just want to do a word substitution with you. Instead of products and services, let's substitute the word work into your documents. Instead of customers and users, let's substitute the words workers and managers. Now, how would a world look if we were constantly experimenting with work through the input and the collaboration with workers and managers? And everyone knew that work is perpetually upgraded and perpetually obsolete. And that just like our software, just like our products, we're going to learn that we will constantly be evolving work through these experiments. We'll try certain experiments, we'll systematically learn what worked and what didn't, just like trying a product feature. We'll keep the ones that do, we'll remove the ones that don't, and we will build on our successes. And what if HR was the equivalent of the design thinking hub for work, the way perhaps product development or software development is a hub for experimentation with your products and services?
So you expand on that line of thinking with some wonderful examples in the book. We're not going to have time to get into all that, but let me ask you a difficult question, because in the past, perhaps you've had the experience, all of us who grew up professionally in the 90s and the 2000s had the experience where our organization would go from a matrix organization, and then 2 years later, we'd go back to a static hierarchical organization. And then 2 years later, everybody's like, it's not working. And we went back to the matrix organization. So in some senses, we were experimenting, but I would submit to you, we didn't realize we were experimenting. We were just reactionary. But please, could you expand on that and how that perhaps could have been done more intelligently had they been actually experimenting in this agile format, and we could have had the more appropriate structure come out of that process.
I think the distinction between reacting and experimenting is a good one, Phil, and it comes up a lot today. When I present this idea of agile experimentation, what I hear from my wonderful colleagues, many of whom are far, far smarter than I am, which is a wonderful world for me to live in, is, John, we're already experimenting. Well, what do you mean? Well, we're allowing our managers and workers to try working 2 days a week, 3 days of work, et cetera, or we have this region in the world where everybody's back to the office and other regions where they're not. And I think, and that's great. And I think that's what I would call at least a reaction, at least an unfreezing of this in a reactionary way. Where I think often we can improve on that is where I might ask the question of how much are you tracking the results of those different situations? Are you approaching it? I think lots of people, like wonderful writers like Adam Grant, Dan Pink, Amy Edmondson, et cetera, have talked about approaching work through a scientific lens, particularly Adam Grant, where we're aware, as he puts it, of learning what we don't know and being aware of what we don't know. And so I would just love to see an overlay on this, like the kind of rigor that product development and software development often bring. Think about the pharmaceutical world where we're experimenting with new vaccines, et cetera. So I think your difference between experimenting and reacting is a really good one, where experimenting in its fullest form would approach each of these opportunities to innovate with an experimental overlay. Someone would be watching, someone would be recording, and there'd be a place to learn. And that's what I mean by HR being this hub for the place all these experiments and the data go to be learned from, digested, and then fed back to the people who are trying out these things.
Yeah, and I will mention to your point, we have many wonderful customers at Coaching Ourselves, and there's a number of folks, in fact, quite a few of them that we work with in the HR domain that are very sophisticated and are doing their best within the context that they have to do these sorts of experiments and learning and so on and so forth. So it's certainly evolved significantly over the last 20 years. That said, as all of us know, we're living in these organizational structures, and there's all sorts of other pressures that make it hard to follow through. But that's why we do the job, to keep things moving. Let me take it to the final stages then. So you end your book with this wonderful statement: the new work operating system may seem daunting at first. Once you realize that work can be usefully deconstructed into tasks and skills, there appear to be infinite combinations and massive issues to confront in your existing talent systems, process models, boundary relationships, and so on. So that's why we recommend starting small with one of the trigger points described in the initial chapters. Expand on that a little bit to give our audience something to take home. And I will mention before everyone goes, buy the book, read it. It's a wonderful read, and you'll get tons out of it. Hopefully, this will whet your appetite today.
Well, thanks, Phil. So in conclusion, I think you put it well. There are two things that Robin and I wanted to emphasize. One is, in the spirit of experimentation, start small, start with prototypes. And I think you'll know where that is, because you'll have the energy of people saying something's not working. We talked about trigger points like automation, workers available who are non-employees, agility, et cetera. So why not go where there's already energy, where people are already saying, we're open to something different because this just isn't working. They don't know that what they might need is this opportunity to think in a deconstructed way. So that's number one. Start small and start where the energy is. And then the second one is what I said before. Try to inculcate, whether we call it a culture, a mindset, et cetera, that work is now perpetually obsolete and new, and it's constantly upgraded. Treat work more like you treat your technology. We're all quite comfortable with constant upgrading of phones, automobiles, et cetera. We've learned to surf in a way, that constant upgrading, not that it's not uncomfortable sometimes, but we accept it. And we know that that's the way the world operates. How about we consider work as perpetually upgraded, and that means perpetually obsolete. And the job, the capability that is fundamental is the ability to see work that way, to surf it, to anticipate the changes, and to be comfortable with moving as work changes.
You know, I could imagine one of the first steps that, let's say, somebody who's listening today could do if they're in the HR team, they could get the HR team together and everybody could talk about the various tasks that they're doing within their jobs and see how that could be optimized by sharing it. And the point I'd make is we tend to do this all the time. Everybody probably says, yes, we already do that. What I love about your work is you formalize it and you give it some vocabulary so that we can think rationally about this and move forward in a way that's brilliant. So
Thank you, Phil. Perfect.
I want to thank you, John, for being here today to share this with everybody. I want to thank everybody who's listening to this now and everybody who chooses to listen to this later. And I will stress once again, the book is Work Without Jobs with Dr. John Boudreau and his colleague. Highly recommended to read. It will definitely give you many lines of thinking about how you can optimize your workforce, how you can solve perhaps some process or agility problems. And certainly, as I've come to discover, people are happier when they get to use all their skills rather than whatever is in that job category that you happen to have slot them into. So thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. This is brought to you by Coaching Ourselves. Please join us for more webinars and free demo sessions.